the decision. We have to also understand that government cannot be seen as a unitary entity. Rather, it must be looked at from the perspective that it is carrying the will and interests of 20 million Zambians on its back.
Meanwhile, in South Africa, the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Ronald Lamola, has also sought to clarify the absence of the U.S. at the third G20 Sherpa meeting currently underway in the Northwest Province. Lamola says the U.S. has sent a letter of apology stating that they would not be attending the meeting due to other commitments. Addressing the media on the margins of the gathering, Lamola says South Africa is not concerned about these developments.
The U.S. indeed have sent us their apology that the Sherpa is attending the NATO summit. We take that as an apology. We are not concerned. We think that the G20 should be able to function with all the member states who are here of the G20, and they have provided us an apology. So we take it at face value, and we think that we'll be able to come out with very progressive and ambitious resolutions out of this meeting.
And remaining in South Africa, the Democratic Alliance has issued a 48-hour ultimatum to President Cyril Ramaphosa over what they call the unjust firing of their Deputy Minister who was in Trade, Industry and Competition, Andrew Whitfield. It has emerged during the post-cabinet briefing yesterday that Whitfield had been removed with no plans for a cabinet reshuffle. DA leader John Steenhuisen has called on the president to remove corrupt African National Congress ministers instead within 48 hours, or run the risk of adverse results from the firing of Whitfield.
This is a calculated assault on the second largest party in the governing coalition. What makes matters worse is that this unilateral action is a result and a product of a flagrant double standard. While a deputy minister is removed for not getting a response to seeking permission to travel, there are members in the cabinet who are implicated in the VBS scandal and looting. There are members in the cabinet who, despite apparently misleading Parliament over an attempt to deploy corrupt cadres to CETA boards, remains in the cabinet.
Africa World Hour. Africa World Hour. Unpacking global headlines from an African perspective.
And of course, we start with one of the major headlines today. We take you live to Kenya, where the media freedom there is under fresh scrutiny after the government ordered a sudden blackout of live TV broadcasts during Wednesday's protest. The Communications Authority instructed stations like KTN News and NTV to halt live coverage, citing security concerns. But journalists and rights groups say it's a clear attempt to silence dissent. To speak about what is happening there and how long the situation is expected to continue around the media ban, press freedom, and of course democracy in general in Kenya, we're joined now by Eric Odoa, who is Secretary General of the Kenya Union of Journalists. A very good evening to you, Eric. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. I do realize that it's within a very busy and tense time in Kenya. What can you tell us about the latest on this?
Thank you so much for hosting me. The latest is that the government has since suspended the order that was enforcing a ban on live coverage on television and radio stations. And before that happened, obviously, journalist rights, human rights organizations had moved to court, and they were able to get orders from the court to suspend that directive. So all of the same, the Communication Authority, which is charged with the responsibility of licensing broadcast media and telecommunication organizations, has since withdrawn the order that was issued yesterday. And
what was the rationale by the presidency in issuing such an order?
They were concerned with the coverage of the protests that took place in Kenya yesterday. We had protests by the young people, commonly known as Gen Zs, trying to protest against some of the things that they feel that are going wrong, one of them being abduction, killings by the police and also bad governance. And the government was concerned from what they are saying, that they were concerned that the live coverage was inciting people to go to the streets to protest, and that's the reason why they wanted to take that decision to stop live coverage of the protest in the various parts of the country.
And what was the result of that ban? Because I understand that what people were doing were actually capturing it on TikTok, on social media, and broadcasting it through those channels. Have any journalists been clamped down on, attacked or detained as a result of the material that actually did make it to people's homes, on their phones, etc.?
So far, there is no journalist who have been arrested or detained. Obviously, in this day and age, there is no way you can stop live coverage and expect that the people will not have other channels of getting information. And when the government issued that ban, as the media stakeholders, we said that we are not going to enforce that ban because it's illegal. Communication Authority of Kenya does not have the mandate to regulate programs and content in the media, and therefore they did not have that mandate. And the order was defied by mainstream media, television stations and radio, and Communication Authority were able to use police and their technicians to go to transmission sites and switch off the signal. But all the same, these television stations were able to switch to YouTube and social media platforms to continue feeding the public with information from the protests. So it didn't bear, or it didn't have any much results, because now we've got different channels that we use to feed the public with information.
And you know, Eric, I saw that there is some audio during the riots, and I think the rounds rather, and I think the Standard even published the story, reports that there were a group of people who were conspiring, and you know, we do apologize to our listeners, viewers, if it's too vivid, but that there were threats of using sexual assault, rape as a weapon against those who took part in the protest. Are you able to tell us a little bit more about this? Because we do understand that there have been allegations of rape made by those who either attended the protest or who intended to.
Yes, obviously there have been the allegations of rape. There have been cases of destruction of private and public property, and also shooting of protesters. Yes, there have been those allegations, and we hope that police will be able to investigate this, because we've seen people come out claiming that their relatives were raped during the protest by people believed to be criminals who took advantage of the protest to commit those crimes.
Was it just really criminals or criminal behavior by people who actually may occupy strategic, important positions within the high echelons of society in Kenya?
You see, what we are saying, because actually this is what we want the government, that immediately you stop live broadcast and you are trying to turn the camera away or a journalist away from covering the protest. That is now when the criminals take advantage, because they know that they can commit any crime without being captured on camera. And exactly that's what happened, because when the government stopped the media from live coverage and trying also to obstruct the media from accessing where the areas where protests were taking place, that is when criminals take advantage to rape, to loot, to destroy property, to burn vehicles, and also to beat up people who are protesting. So basically, that's what happened.
And I ask these questions very pointedly, Eric, because I'm trying to gauge what the democratic norms are now as you are experiencing them in Kenya, particularly not just with regards to media freedom, but citizenry rights, because the anniversary yesterday was over what happened a year ago, and that was speaking out especially around tax law changes. But then a month ago, then a blogger who died. According to police, it was self-inflicted wounds as a result of reporting on some of these issues. And then a man was killed point blank by police during protests over the blogger's death in incarceration. So is there limited space to speak out? Is there limited space for dissent within Kenya nowadays? Or is that a little too reductionary in saying so?
Basically, that is why we're having these protests, because the people believe that we are having dictatorship creeping in. Because remember our history, we had a regime that was in power until 2002, and this regime was accused of dictatorship, abduction, extrajudicial killing, and when there was a regime change in that year, some of these things actually were done away with, and people never thought that Kenya will get to a situation whereby people cannot speak, people cannot express themselves, people will be abducted, we will have cases of extrajudicial killing, people dying in police custody, and this is what actually is bringing people to the streets. This is what actually is motivating people to come to the streets so that they can protest the dictatorship that is slowly taking shape in Kenya, whereby people cannot express themselves, people cannot be allowed to protest without facing the full wrath of police. So basically, that is the reason why people are protesting. People are protesting because they believe that the space is being squeezed, what we call the civil space, is being squeezed, and people cannot use the available channels to express themselves. When you do that, you are either arrested, you are abducted, or you just there's forced disappearance, and that is what is forcing people to go to the streets to protest against that, when they're saying that we've been here before as a country until 2002 when there was a regime change. So we do not expect the current regime to take us back to the old ways of doing things during that regime that was brought to an end in 2002.
Eric, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Eric Odoa is Secretary General of the Kenya Union of Journalists, speaking to us about the recent media blackout during protests on Wednesday. Of course, as we mentioned, it did take the High Court to order authorities to lift the ban on live broadcast. But he's also talking about the general democratic environment, landscape in Kenya, not just for journalists, but for those who believe they want to speak out against what the government is doing.
Africa in Business on Channel Africa.
The president of the Arab Bank for Economic Development in Africa, Badea, Dr. Sidi Ould Tah, he is vying for the presidency of the African Development Bank, the AFDB. He positions himself as a fervent defender of economic integration and structural transformation on the African continent.
Well, I do believe that I have a 360 view of the development challenges in the continent, with my experience from both the supply side and the demand side. But more importantly, my vision is to bring on board all the stakeholders and to have a holistic approach for the development of the continent, and to develop partnership across the continent and outside the continent, bringing all the stakeholders together to work for one goal, is to make Africa green for life and livelihood of the African population.
Bringing the African markets into your home. Channel Africa, the African perspective. Tsepiso Makwetla winds it down on Africa World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.
And that brings the time to just about 18 minutes past 9, just a reminder that at about 21:40 we will be speaking to Tembisa Fakude, Senior Research Fellow at the Africa-Asia Dialogues. We'll be zoning in on Zoran Mamdani, a commentary around the South African schooled man who is getting very much nearer to clinching the mayoral post in New York City. What does this mean for the political landscape in the United States? And now we turn our attention to Eastern Chad, where tens of thousands of Sudanese refugees have fled ongoing violence in northern Darfur. While they found safety from bombs, many are now battling hunger, disease, and of course dire living conditions in overcrowded camps. Joining us now is Dr. Jean-Paul Nzabandora from Doctors Without Borders to speak to us about what is the scale of the crisis and what needs to happen on the ground urgently now. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Nzabandora.
Hi, good evening.
So just talk to us about the numbers. What is the current situation? I mean, I said, yes?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I was asking, what is the current situation? I put the figures at tens of thousands. Do we have more finite figures?
Yes, so UNHCR have registered over 45,000 persons who have officially registered themselves since roughly April, when Zamzam camp was dismantled by the attacks that RSF had on the camp. However, it is very difficult to have a clear and accurate estimation because people also cross from unofficial borders, and the border is very, very wild and very big as well.
I do apologize to you and to our viewers and listeners. I believe I've given you an honorary African surname. It's just Dr. Jean-Paul. Thank you so much. So just talk to us about the situations in the Tine and Ure Kasoni camps. What are the major challenges? And especially, I'd imagine with space constriction, if people are displaced, the closest that they can find is where they'll go.
Yeah, I think what is important to remember is that we're speaking about the Sahel. So picture the Sahara Desert and the beginning of the Sahara Desert. So we're in a situation where we're in the savannah and starting the desert. So there's stifling heat. It's 40 degrees. It's hot. There's the sun. These people don't have anywhere where to shade themselves. They don't have any water, and this is not a problem because there's a lot of space. The problem is access to water, access to shelter, access to care, access to food, because essentially there's little to nothing around.
So basically, what you're emphasizing is those who actually are able to make it, they're given the ghastly conditions under which that not only they're fleeing, but they're enduring to get to safety.
Yeah, exactly, and it's quite important. What you mentioned is the people who actually make it. So we're speaking about very vulnerable people, but we're also speaking about the very vulnerable people who actually made it through from the areas that are really, really, even worse in North Darfur. So amongst the people left behind are even more vulnerable. The people we are seeing are in very dark conditions, but they're the lucky ones if we want to kind of put it that way.
And let's get a little bit more specific of what you're dealing with, because I understand you've reported something in the region of 7,700 consultations at the Tine Health Post alone. What kind of injuries, illnesses are you receiving people in, and what other conditions are we not mentioning?
So the majority of people come to us with it's a primary health post. So the majority of the people who managed to cross are relatively in good health. And when I say relatively, it's relatively because there's malaria, there's malnutrition, There are, different infections that are usually vaccine preventable that we are seeing in these camps, because in the areas in North Darfur, there haven't been any vaccination activities for the past years. And so we're seeing diseases like measles within the population that we're seeing. And then, of course, there are occasional people who are war injured. It's a small minority, but still quite significant injuries. So we've seen people with open fractures. We've seen people who have had amputations because of bombing and because of explosions and because of the fighting.
And just looking at water scarcity, and we know the cholera outbreak in the region, what further complications is that presenting for you? Lack of even health infrastructure. What is the humanitarian landscape like in Eastern Chad?
Yeah, so water is very scarce. So we're talking about an area that is by nature, because it's the Sahel, it's water scarce. So we're putting there's already a strain on the water as a resource, and over and above, we're adding thousands of people in relatively crowded and concentrated conditions where they even don't have access to any water, or to little water. Add to that the fact that there are no sanitary facilities. Add to that the fact that in areas in northern Darfur and in areas in West Darfur, we have confirmed cases of cholera. So it's a ticking bomb when it comes to waterborne diseases, including cholera, and it's particularly dire because currently water is scarce. We are doing our best doing water trucking. One of the main issues is that the people who find themselves in these camps are unfortunately not being supported by a lot of other NGOs. There's a dire need of humanitarian action in these areas, and we're looking at a lack of humanitarian actors in the area. And so yes, we're doing our best, but clearly our best is still not enough for these people.
And just a quick final, but a very important question. We've just been speaking about it in the violent protests we're seeing in Kenya, that of sexual and reproductive health rights and services. We understand that some of these displaced people, refugees, are actually encountering sexual assault on their way there. And of course, some already come from that. What are some of the types of support that you can offer that is available to you, and what do you have a shortage of in helping to support those who've been affected?
So yes, indeed, we are seeing survivors of sexual violence. The majority of people we're seeing are women and children. And we have seen a good number of victims or survivors of sexual violence. And the needs are, of course, great from the medical side. But before the medical side, what people need is shelter, is feeling safe, it's water, it's having food. And the basics are still not there. And it's very important that when we speak of what people need, everyone needs to have the basic things which are not there. We're a medical humanitarian organization. We can do the basic needs. We can try to give the basic needs to people when there's a gap, when there's a huge gap. But of course, we are not the actors who should be doing that, which is why really the biggest needs right now on the field is access to shelter, access to food, access to water.
Dr. Jean-Paul from Doctors Without Borders speaking to us about the situation in Eastern Chad, where tens of thousands of Sudanese refugees are fleeing to. Thank you so much for your time.
Vue d'Afrique avec Joël Mouteba.
Alors peut-on considérer cette décision comme un désengagement durable des États-Unis vis-à-vis du développement africain ou s'agit-il d'un simple réalignement stratégique?
Non, ça peut être les deux à la fois. Donc, au lieu de donner de l'argent à la Banque africaine de développement pour partager en vrac, ils préfèrent maintenant donc cibler les pays partenaires en Afrique. Ça, c'est pour le réalignement stratégique. Alors, et aussi, ce n'est pas un désengagement durable, mais je pense que dans les 2 ou 3 prochaines années, il veut d'abord remettre de l'ordre dans ces affaires.
Vue d'Afrique. Du lundi au vendredi de 15h à 16h, temps universel.
In this episode of Channel Africa Conversations, Peter talks to Dr. Tulisile Buda, an academic, author, and an expert in indigenous knowledge systems. Join us for a compelling discussion on preserving African languages and traditions in the digital era. Dr. Tulisile unpacks the role of educators, explorers, and how technologies like AI can support cultural preservation, and challenges us to rethink how we honor African heritage. You can find the episode on YouTube, SABC Plus, and on our website, channelafrica.co.za. This episode is a must-listen for educators, creators, and change makers across the continent. Channel Africa, the African perspective. At the forefront, the most pressing issues on Africa World Hour with Sepiso Magwetu.
Channel Africa.
And the world's richest 1% have seen their wealth soar by nearly $34 trillion since 2015, enough to end global poverty 22 times over. That's according to a new Oxfam report released ahead of a major UN development financing summit in Spain. Oxfam says global development is abysmally off track as aid budgets shrink, inequality deepens, and private finance dominates. We now speak to Susana Ruiz, the tax policy lead at Oxfam International, about the findings and what needs to change. Susana, very good evening to you. Thank you so much for speaking to us. I'd like to say I'm shocked, but it seems like every year the rich get richer and the number of people who actually share the lion's share of global wealth shrinks, that it's going into fewer and fewer hands.
It's true, and we are also shocked. And it was even more important to be talking about that when we are just ahead of this big summit in Sevilla that's going to gather representatives from 192 countries. And what we see is that this extreme wealth concentration is also responsible for the financing gap in achieving sustainable development goals. So everything that it's meant to be invested from countries to achieve a better development for all countries, especially in the global south, it's harmed by this effect of extreme wealth concentration.
And I don't know if it is possible from the report to glean where that money comes from. Because if we're talking about official development aid cuts, which are normally from a government, do the wealthy, the 1%ers, get their wealth from governments?
So in fact, what we see is that the global development system has prioritized the investment through private actors, with the idea, a false idea, that investing through private actors was going to leverage much more money for countries in the global south. But in fact, what has happened is that those private actors are only prioritizing their own interest and creating more revenues. They are getting them more richer, but it's not really helping countries in the global south, those who really need more revenues to invest in health, in education, in social protection. So it's not that the money comes from directly from the countries in the global north to the top 1%, but instead of being channeled directly to the public system in the global south, it's using private actors with a false idea, and is creating even a bigger financing gap.
And we know that most of those who are affected, particularly in the global south, would be women, children and adolescents. And they themselves are people who are typically encumbered by poverty, by unemployment. They basically have not much leverage in trying to improve their situation. So what are Global South governments doing about this? And I also want to talk about the role of things like corruption. Is this why the situation is what it is? So I wasn't necessarily looking at the Global South, but I was just looking at the global economy. If these 1%ers make their money off already crippled governments, so to speak.
The corruption is also an issue for many countries in the North and in the Global South. But in this case, what we are trying to show is that it's the system, how this global economic system is designed that is undermining the capacity for countries in the Global South to have access to their own finances system. So it's a problem because it forces countries to be to leverage in more debt. But this level of debt, public debt, is using this international system, is getting more expensive under very terrible conditions, is being not easily negotiated, and it means that, in fact, more than 3.3 billion people are living in countries where governments are spending more in paying for this debt service than in investing in health and education. So it's a very perverse international system that is depriving those countries in the Global South from using the money that they are collecting into investing it more in their own capacities, in a better development.
And there often is, erroneously, as from what you're saying, that the more people have, the more philanthropic work that they're doing to ensure that they help those who are in need. So if you could just characterize the most acute aspects of this private finance takeover that you are highlighting, and also what are the particular tax proposals or financial reforms that you think need to be put in place now for us to even make a dent on those SDGs?
Philanthropy is not a bad thing per se, but it means that those rich individuals, those philanthropists, are going to decide what kind of health system or education system is going to be taking place in many the countries where they are operating. So what makes much more sense is that most of the countries can leverage their own capacity through the tax system or through their own capacity of their own funding. The problem with global aid is that in many countries, especially in very poor or vulnerable countries, this aid is extremely necessary and is saving life. And what we see is that G7 countries, the richest economies, are cutting their aid to countries in the Global South at this moment by 28%, very likely. And that is expected to have a very severe impact in the capacity to invest in vaccines or in access to very necessary treatments. For example, it's estimated that in the next 5 years, it can generate 2.9 million people dying because of aid. If this aid from northern countries, rich northern countries, is stopping, so it's a very drastic and unexpected level of cut. It's the highest ever, the most dramatic cut we've seen since we have records in the 60s. And it's happening in a very accelerated way, creating disruption for many countries that were not expecting this to happen.
Susanna, I wish we had more time. Much appreciated. Susanna Ruiz is tax policy lead at Oxfam International. She's taking part in that conference in Seville, where it's been revealed that with only 16% of SDGs on track, that there is urgent action needed to change what is happening, the response to the poorest of the poor, particularly through public systems with a public-first approach.
The Morning Switch Weekend with the Shy Guy.
The Shy Guy, a Morning Switch.
Have you ever listened to a song and then it gives you goosebumps? Cause it takes you way back in the 80s. My goodness. Yay. Hey, baby. You hear Yvonne Chaga Chaga there. I wanna talk to the DJ. And then the DJ goes like, hey baby, I've got you on the other side. Huh? There were no WhatsApps then, right? There were no sliding in the DMs at the time. Oh man.
Your weekend mornings are activated with the Shy Guy on the Morning Switch. Africa World Hour. Africa World Hour. Unpacking global headlines from an African perspective.
Just about 21 minutes to 10. Rwanda is once again under the spotlight for its treatment of political opposition. On the 19th of June, Victor Ingabire, leader of the unregistered Dalfa Umurunzi party, was rearrested in Kigali. Authorities claim she is linked to an ongoing trial involving several of her party members who have been detained since 2021. The charges include forming a criminal group and inciting public disorder. Accusations partly based on the group's reading of a book on non-violent resistance and participation in peaceful training. To speak to us about this is Louis Mudge, Central Africa Director at Human Rights Watch, who's been following the case very clearly. A very good evening to you, Louis. Thank you so much for speaking to us. I mean, just as I'm reading that, the idea that you could be incarcerated for reading a book on non-violent resistance and participation in peaceful training, it does boggle the mind. So just give us a brief context, a history of how we came to be here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It boggles the mind, and yet this is a very accurate reflection of the situation in Rwanda. The fact is that there's a group of people who had organized a training in which they were going to discuss this book on, to your point, nonviolent ways to resist authoritarianism. They're now over 3 years into this trial. Most of those 3 years have been in pretrial detention on incitement, basically on state security charges, on incitement, inciting people to rise up against the state, tarnishing the image of Rwanda, etc. This is the trial that Victoire Ingabire has been lumped in with. I think it's important to highlight two things. Number one, Victoire Ingabire was already detained for many, many years in Rwanda. She had a long stint. She was given a 15-year sentence. She was pardoned by the president and released. But she was given, she did, many, many years in Rwanda before being released. And number two is that some of the individuals in this trial also had done many, many years of prison before being rearrested for this case in 2021. So it really, the takeaway is this. If you're going to dare to organize, if you're going to dare to have a political platform outside of the ruling RPF, this is what awaits you.
And this, you say, is part of a pattern, because we've heard reports, seen reports, certainly here in South Africa, we've been witness to that, people who are in opposition to the government in Rwanda and what happens to them despite Rwanda's denial of these accusations. But just from your readings, your learnings, can you just paint a picture for us about how oppressive the environment is for the opposition?
Yeah, any South African who has a pulse on current events will know that Rwandans in South Africa are not safe as well. The fact is that what's happening internally to this Rwandan opposition that's daring to try to be an opposition, a meaningful, real opposition in a meaningful sense in Rwanda. We're seeing in real time what's happening to them. This is just an example of the pattern of repression, both inside and outside Rwanda, that the ruling RPF party and its executive, Paul Kagame, exert upon anyone who dares to challenge the power. Now, that can come in the form that we've seen here, but it can also come in the form of assassinations, targeted assassinations across Africa. It can come in intimidation, the disappearing of family members for people who are further afield, whether they be in Australia, Europe, or the United States. It really is a relentless machine that targets anyone and everyone who they perceive as being outside of their program. And it certainly has led to the deaths and assassinations of people. And we at Human Rights Watch, for years, we've been documenting this. We're not the only ones. This is nothing new. I mean, Rwanda's making news right now because of the incursions into the Congo, because of its support to M23, because of the war crimes and potential crimes against humanity that are being committed in the Congolese soil right now. But people should also turn the lens inside and see what's happening in Rwanda. And I think that this case of Victoire Ingabire is emblematic of that.
And I'm just wondering about political freedoms, because depending on whom you speak to and their relationship with the state. I mean, if we take case in point, this book, Blueprint for a Revolution, the interpretation of what a revolution is and what you espouse, I'm sure is something that will, it's either a live or die situation.
It's live or die. Look, this book, Blueprint for a Revolution, you can find it here in the United States on Amazon. You could buy it in any bookshop in South Africa. In any context in which the government is not terrified of its people, this book is not a threat. This book just tells you how to mount a political platform, how to try to get people behind your ideas, and how to try to resist authoritarian powers. But in Rwanda, that's taboo, and that's absolutely not going to be tolerated. The fact is that President Kagame effectively, whilst he didn't become officially the president until 2000, but he effectively took over Rwanda in July 1994. And there's been absolutely no change since then in terms of the executive. And the political space, the freedom of expressions, the freedoms of association that a normal person would associate with everyday life has been constricted in Rwanda to where we are today, where you have just a handful of people trying to have some meaningful political opposition, and these people are looking at potentially serious prison time on the horizon.
Lewis, unfortunately, we have run out of time, but next time we will make it a longer conversation. So I do appreciate your time and your insights. Lewis Mudge is a Central Africa Director at Human Rights Watch, speaking to us about the rearrest of Victoire Ingabire and the broader climate for political opposition in Rwanda.
África. Conhece o Ntivani?
Claro que sou eu.
Ntivani é o amante da música de corpo e alma.
Eu amo música africana.
Ele aprecia todos os tipos de melodias e passa os seus dias a ouvir a Channel Africa. Adivinha só, a Channel Africa quer ajudar o Ntivani e os amantes da música em todo o lado a descobrir ainda mais música incrível. Por isso, a Channel Africa está a convocar artistas africanos a submeterem as suas músicas. Músicos, lembrem-se de nos dar todas as informações relevantes no music@channelafrica.co.za. As submissões são a vossa oportunidade de ser ouvidos, mas não garantem inclusão na lista. Todas as submissões serão cuidadosamente analisadas para verificar se cumprem os requisitos da nossa estação. Canal África, a perspectiva africana.
Africa World Hour, unpacking global headlines from an African perspective.
And it brings the time to 13 minutes to 10 here on Africa World Hour. So today we explore a political story that has is as unlikely, rather, as it's electrifying. One that stretches from the classrooms of Cape Town to the corridors of power in New York City. Zoran Mamdani, a democratic socialist, former rapper, and a proud child of African soil, is now the frontrunner to become the next mayor of New York. His win in the Democratic primary wasn't just a local upset. It was a seismic signal of shifting tides in American politics. But this isn't just about one man. At a time when MAGA rhetoric fuels fear of the foreign other, Mamdani's ascent invites a deeper conversation, not only about identity, power, and the emergence of a new hyphen in politics: South African, New Yorker, Ugandan, American, global, progressive. What does this really mean? The rise for the U.S. and the rise of Mamdani in the US. We speak now to Thembisa Fakude, who's a senior research fellow at the Africa-Asia Dialogues, to speak about this. Thembisa, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, and I do apologize for the delay in getting to you. So Mamdani's rise as so-called one of our own, this is the conversation that we seem to be having, and I was just wondering if are we beginning to see more and more South Africans in positions of power in the US? Or has it just really been the case that we haven't paid attention before?
Well, I don't know whether he does regard himself as South African, but South Africans, of course, are very quick in
to claim him, of
embracing, embracing and claiming those that once or any association with South Africa. But again, I think he's got a very strong identity. His attitude towards politics reflects his association with his country. His socialist style also reflects his association with his country, confidence and courage. He is a typical South African, even though he has not himself declared that he's South African. We know that his father, of course, has got origins both in India and in Uganda, and he's bringing in some an element of pressure in U.S. politics. But there are so many Americans who are looking for alternative at the moment, and I think his politics, which are embracing everyone, and has been endorsed not only by Muslims and Christians, but also Jews in New York. So we're looking forward to November to see what's going to happen.
And let's talk about his father, his mother. His father, a well-respected academic with high-profile writings, and his mother, very also influential, particularly in the film industries and other spaces where she has been an influencer. But his politics, we've seen Donald Trump refer to him as, so he refers to himself as a socialist, but I think Donald Trump called him, and I'll try and find the right term. I can't even understand why I'm not finding it. He called him a socialist, but he basically suggested that if he is added, that Americans are quote unquote, and I won't say the word, but is he as dangerous ideologically as Donald Trump seems to want to paint him as?
No, I don't think so. I think his mentor is Bernie Sanders, who has embraced
communist. That's the term. Sorry, I don't. Yes, he's called him a communist.
Yes, he's very close to Bernie Sanders, and he has said that he got inspiration from Bernie Sanders. But the word communist in the United States is almost it's a dangerous word, and he has openly called himself that, and which makes me believe that if he continues with this trajectory, which I don't think is the right one in a country like the U.S., he's likely to hit a lot of hurdles as he moves along in his political career, because he's embracing very deeply entrenched political positions that would be very difficult to deviate from, no spin later on in his career. He has embraced anyone who calls himself a communist at this day and age he's likely to hit a number of brick walls in his political career, and I think that's what he has done. But at the same time, the Americans are looking for alternative, and I think he is an alternative, and whatever it takes to replace the current Republican toxic politics, people will go with that. And that's what is bringing at the moment.
And in fact, if you look at what some of his opponents, particularly MAGA adjacent opponents, are saying, they've called him too extreme. But the ideas that he's coming up with, for instance, include free buses, rent freezes, even city-owned grocery stores funded by taking from the wealthy. Even his position in Israel, I'm sure, is likely to rub people the wrong way. But given the situation, the fact that it seems there are Americans who are even angry with Donald Trump for taking them to another war, this time with Iran, do you think there is greater sympathy to be accrued?
I think so. I think there's greater sympathy. But whether they actually like Mr. Mamdani or not is another story. We'll have to wait and see what's going to happen. But I think right now, with people desperate and people desperate for new alternative to Donald Trump, here comes a young, fresh elite to an extent, because he comes from a very good family, notwithstanding his politics, which are purporting him to be siding with the poor and the downtrodden. He's middle class in the United States, and he's coming up with politics that many people are desperate for at the moment, given the hatred that MAGA movement led by Donald Trump and others have introduced in the United States. So it's a breath of fresh air. But my only concern is that he has taken very radical positions, which are going to be really difficult to, for a lack of a better term, spin or change later on in life, because serious questions are going to emerge. And knowing the vibrancy of the United States, he's going to find it very, very difficult to navigate the political space given the positions that he's embraced so far.
And I want to look at the US's left evolution. You spoke about Bernie Sanders. He, obviously, from what you're saying and what he said, is likely to get endorsements from him. What about the AOC? And does that mean it'll help broaden his base? So he calls himself a democratic socialist, but as you say, if we even refer to communism, a broader understanding of the U.S. community it's a bad word, and especially if one is not steeped in political theory. Will they even give him a chance?
Well, I think they'll give him a chance in New York. It depends how he's going to do in New York. And also depends how flexible he's going to be in terms of admitting that certain positions were incorrect or wrong. But I can assure you that as he moves along in this political ladder, is likely to face a lot of challenges and questions. In New York at the moment, of course, his politics are favorable because of what Donald Trump has done, not only in institutions of higher learning, including Harvard and others. So they do need someone like him. And by the way, his endorsements, given what's happening in the Middle East and the tensions between Iran and the Israelis, you have a partnership between a Muslim and a Jew. His other competitors outside Como were those of Jewish descent, and they've endorsed him, and they believe that he can do a good job. And they have a lot of other small business people in the United States endorsing him as an alternative at the moment to the Republican politics. So he's likely to make it this time around because there's desperation. But we don't know who's going to be the candidate. I mean, people are now talking about him even going on to compete for the presidency of the United States. We don't know yet. So until he passes and goes through the hurdle of November, we can't really say much in terms of his future political career.
But what about what some have pointed to as an ideological warfare within the Democratic Party? And they've even saying he could be an albatross of sorts for the Democratic Party. So how do you see it likely play out within the party's fault lines between the progressives and centrist wings?
I think it's going to face a lot of pushback within the party because there are a lot of entrenched capitalists and free marketeers within the party, and people who do not or will accept anything that has got a label of communism or socialism within the Democratic Party, a party that's been known for a very long time to have pushed back on communist ideas, and here he is now a candidate. I think as he moves along, he's going to find it very difficult to continue with that, because clearly the Democrats have always been, notwithstanding of course that they've embraced liberal politics, which has been the foundation of the political ideology and movement, for lack of a better term, but to be a self-confessed communist within that camp, I'm not sure whether that's going to fly as time goes on.
But what about the Republicans? Does it present an opportunity for them to move the tectonic plates somewhat in favor of, and when we look at Mamdani, it's been said that he certainly seems to have appeal amongst younger Americans. Would the Republicans then seize upon criticism of him where it serves them, but also try and emulate him in places that could garner more votes from the youth?
I think so. I think they are preparing themselves now for a much more bigger war. That's one. But I think the other thing that we're all struggling from, not only as commentators, academics, and politicians, is coming up with new terms that define our politics. So we stick around with old description because there's nothing else that will describe what we feel and hope to achieve at the moment. So his politics I don't think his politics entirely could describe him as a communist, for example, or as a socialist. But because there are no terms at the moment, academically and politically, that are replacing these old terms, we are quick to find cover under these old defined terms, which are not necessarily definitive of who we are at the moment. And it is a responsibility of people and young people like himself to come up with new terms. There's a need for us to relook at the narratives and political narratives that have been used all along in politics, because we're living in a different world. We're living in a world of AI, a world of social media, a world of it's a mix of different ideologies that define who we are. I mean, if you look at him, the way he is dressed up, where he comes from, I don't think he's a communist. I think is something else.
In fact, he calls himself a progressive Muslim immigrant.
Well, yeah, maybe that could be a new term. But he doesn't fit. For me, I don't see him fitting the definition of what communism is, as a South African who studied communism and the trappings and characteristics and all the traits that define this body of politics. Right. So that's where I think we find ourselves most of the time trapped in.
So that's until the next conversation. I really do appreciate you taking the time. Much, much appreciated your time and insights. Tembisa Fakude, Senior Research Fellow at the Africa-Asia Dialogues, bringing an end to our conversation on who is likely to be New York City's next mayor. And of course, if it's Zoran Mamdani, what does it mean? Not only for him personally, but for US politics. That's how we come to the end of Africa World Hour this evening. Thanks for joining us. Do enjoy the rest of your viewing and listening here on Channel Africa, the African Perspective. Up next is Hotlines with Shayla Ndukumana.
Africa World Hour. Africa World Hour. Unpacking global headlines from an African perspective. Hotlines bring you fresh perspectives about love after dark. With Shayla Ndukumana.
C'est pas n'est plus rampé, c'est pas y masser, c'est pas y poser, saute crier aux amis. Ça fait ouais des côtés qui m'ont gagné, qui m'ont mon vie.